So the theme of this afternoon is about riparian and water quality in post-fire environments. And our first speaker that we're going to bring up is Laura Six. Actually, it's a group of folks from NCASI, National Council on Air and Stream Improvement. And they're going to be talking about riparian vegetation dynamics 2 years after mixed severity fire in the Western Cascades, Oregon. So help me welcome up Laura to start.
Okay. Thank you. It is actually just me. So I'm Laura Six. I'm a forest ecologist at Weyerhaeuser, but this project is collaborating with Ashley Coble and Jake Vershuyl at NCASI. And this project is actually part of a larger research effort with NCASI looking at both aquatic and terrestrial dynamics after mixed severity fire. But this presentation will be on the riparian vegetation 2 years after our mixed severity fire. And I should plug too that Ashley and Brooke Petaluna will be talking about the aquatic side of this project in a few more talks. So just to give a little bit of context, although we're all really familiar at this point, but we're in the kind of managed side of the Western Cascades with this work. This is productive managed forest land. About half of the state of Oregon is forested, and we have multiple landowners in play. So about 17% of Oregon is in privately owned forests. And so our NCASI partners are working together on this. In 2020, we're all very familiar at this point, but wildfires went across this landscape. So not only did we have this dynamic of forest mosaic of different intensively managed, less managed forests, different age stands, but we now have this mosaic of mixed severity fire overlaid on top of it. Multiple fires of varying intensity, and one early estimate from the 2020 fires in the Northwest in general, so over the larger area, was about 700,000 acres were burned. But this is one of the more severe areas that we had. So we decided to lay out some research. That's one silver lining, I guess, when you own a lot of land and a lot of it gets burned is, well, let's at least study it. That's one good outcome we can have. So we wanted to look at the riparian area response to fire, and there are a few reasons why specifically we wanted to look in the riparian area. We've learned a lot the past couple days too, but what is well understood relatively is upland vegetation response to fire. That's where fires tend to occur, is in upland drier forests. So we have a pretty good handle on the vegetation layer response to fire in upland forests. We also have a fairly good understanding of riparian overstory response to fire. So we have a fairly good understanding of what happens to the trees after fire and how those recover or how slow they are to recover. But what is less known is what the response of the riparian area vegetation is to fire. So the multiple layers, not just the overstory, but what about the shrubs and the understory? What happens after fire? And how are those layers of vegetation impacted by post-fire management, so salvage and replanting strategies? How does that impact vegetation recovery? And we really wanted to ask if riparian and understory vegetation was critical to recovery in riparian areas. So how can we get back to this? And can the understory layers aid in recovery when the overstory is burned? So our study, we chose 24 streams, basically by choosing 24 watersheds first. So these are watersheds across the Riverside, Beachy, and Holiday Farm fires. And within each of those watersheds, we chose a stream reach. So we had 24 total. They were small perennial streams. So these are perennial fourth-order fish-bearing streams. These were laid across multiple landowners, and because of that, multiple management intensities. So we had private industrial landowners all the way to state and federal land that was less actively managed. And we stratified on the watershed scale, so across these delineated sites by burn severity. So we had buckets of none, minor, major, and complete burn across the whole watershed. And by mean stand age, which we used as a surrogate for management intensity. So stands were either the watershed scale, so mean stand age was either younger than 85 years old, or we can think of that as our actively managed areas, or older than 85 years old, so that's our less active management. And then, so at the sites themselves, again, we've got 24 study sites, which were 100-meter stream reach. Our site-level data collection at the stream, we had things like canopy cover, light, and stream temp, and I'm not showing that with this talk, but Ashley will get into that in a few talks later this afternoon. We focused on the riparian management zone. So at each site, we laid out 4 transects. On each transect, we had an overstory plot, where within that plot, we collected data on every stem, whether it was live or dead, and the species and diameter. And then on each transect, we collected data on shrub cover and coarse woody debris using line intercept methods. And then along those transects, we had 1 meter square quadrats for the forb-layer vegetation, placed at the stream edge at 0 meters and then going out up to 50 meters. And we alternated either side of the stream so we could look at the full kind of suite of buffer vegetation. So we collected data in 2021, so that was the first field season we had after the fires, again in 2022 last summer, and our plan is to collect each year for 5 years and then think about what longer-term data collection we want to do following that. And then we also have some photo points too, and I'll show you some examples of these sites in just a sec. And then our analysis primarily were generalized linear mixed models, using age and burn severity as a two-way interaction. And then for transect level data like shrubs, we use site as a random effect. And then for plot level data like the forb-layer vegetation, site and transect as a random effect. So to show you an example of what burn severity look like in these riparian areas themselves, we're going to start with the 0% burn. So if anybody's not familiar with a riparian forest, this is what they look like. They're really shrubby, really thick vegetation, really shaded. There's a couple field crew personnel in the photo laying out the transect tape. They're not that far away, but it's hard to maintain a visual in these really thick sites. But this is our norm, typically. Our minor burned watersheds, so this again was calculated at the watershed level. So these were less than half of the watershed was burned. So it ended up being anywhere from 3 to 45% of the watershed was burned. But at the site, this is what they could typically look like. You see a little bit of bare ground, perhaps. You're losing a little bit of vegetation. There's a more open canopy, so you're seeing higher light conditions. The major burn sites, so over half of the entire watershed burned here. So at the site, that ended up being like 55 to 92% of the watershed burned. But at the site, you're really seeing a difference now. So you're seeing a lot of bare ground. You're seeing evidence of char, so there's burned tree trunks, more missing overstory, less shrub layer, less forb layer. You can see exposed soil in some cases. And then our complete burn sites, over 99% of the entire watershed has burned for these. And it's very obvious at the site level. There's virtually no overstory at this point. It's very brown, very charred. The shrub layer and the forb layer look almost absent. And I should note too, all of these photos were taken at the stream edge at each of these sites, looking out through the buffer. So this is the visual of the entire width of the buffer. Okay, so going from the visual, how did that actually translate into the data? We're going to first start with canopy cover. So this is a shade provided by the overstory. And we're splitting it between the young stands. So these were the more actively managed sites, so less than 85 years old, and the older stands. In the young stands, we are seeing greater canopy loss after fire. So we went from virtually 100% canopy cover at the no burn to about 30-35% canopy cover in those complete burn sites. And I've split the data into year 1, it was the green data point, and year 2 is in yellow. Compare that to the older stands. There's less drastic loss in canopy cover, but there's more change 2 years following fire. So there's a bit of a delay in the older stands or the less managed sites in that loss of canopy cover, where the young stands saw that loss right away. So going from the canopy cover, so the shade provided by the trees, to the actual trees themselves, split again between the young and the old. Young stands showed high mortality with fire and some increase, like further increase in mortality after 2 years. So this corresponds to what we're seeing in the canopy cover. There's no mortality and a no burn. You have healthy trees, healthy stands in the riparian buffers, up to like 75% loss of the overstory in those complete burn sites. Compared that to the older stands, a lot less mortality. In the complete burn sites, maybe half of the trees are dead, and it's fairly steady between year 1 and year 2. And then this is more descriptive than anything, but we wanted to look at the overstory by species just to tease out a little bit of differences. So now this is just the older stands so far. The top figure is year 1, so that's 2021 data by species, and the bottom is 2022. For these older stands, we're seeing higher mortality in coniferous species than deciduous. So things like western red cedar and western hemlock have higher mortality than what is common also in like red alder and big leaf maple. In the younger stands, again, year 1 is on top, and then year 2 on the bottom. We're seeing high mortality with high severity fire in general. We're losing just across all the species, basically. And there's increased mortality in year 2 following high severity fire. You see on that complete burn site, year 1, there's quite a bit of mortality, but by year 2, virtually everything is dead. And it was interesting being out on these sites. I remember one, we're measuring, like a big leaf maple. It's charred year 1, but you look up, there's 2 or 3 leaves that are technically there and new and alive, but by year 2, that just wasn't enough to sustain it. So it's calculated dead by year 2. So it's interesting that we're seeing that delay, and that other folks talked about yesterday, that delayed mortality. We're seeing that even through the riparian buffer too. So now going from the overstory, working our way down to the understory. In the absence of the overstory, so in this stream reach, for instance, when you lose a lot of the canopy, what's the contribution of the understory to provide habitat and stream shade, or do they? Or at what point do they? So we're going to start with the shrubs, and we classified shrubs as anything woody taller than 1 meter, but not part of the overstory canopy. So trying to get that middle ground of the woody species. So 2 years after fire, both shrub cover and shrub species richness decreased with fire severity. So just kind of across the board, with major and complete fire, we lost not only the cover of species, but the number of shrub species as well. And the most common species, just to give you an idea of the composition, in year 1, the most common shrub species across all our sites were things like vine maple, salmonberry, big hazelnut, Indian plum, rhododendron, very common, typical shrub species in riparian areas. In year 2, we're still seeing vine maple and salmonberry, but now we're seeing tree species in the shrub layer come in. So these are at least 1 meter tall, but not in the overstory. And so commonly we're seeing big leaf maple and western hemlock seedlings, and then also huckleberry, which had always been around, but I think more common as other shrub species were more susceptible after fire. And then working our way down even further to the forb layer, this is anything herbaceous or non-woody, or woody species that were shorter than 1 meter, so just real small starts and seedlings. For forb species cover, I split this between streamside and upland, so we've pooled the forest age at this point. But since we have plots based on distance from stream, we wanted to tease out some riparian differences. So streamside vegetation versus upland vegetation. And we're seeing an increase in both stream and upland vegetation plots with high severity fire 2 years later. So not a year after, but 2 years after, we're seeing an increase in cover. Forb species richness, so the number of species around, streamside species richness increased with high severity fire only in year 1. By year 2, we've lost some of those species. And upland species richness increased with fire, and that remained consistent. And the differences are not very drastic, you can see. They're really subtle, but there's some differences in time since fire. And then again, to give you an idea of the composition of these sites, the common species varied by burn severity and year or time since fire. So commonly at the no burn sites, so this is just what we would commonly see in a riparian buffer, things like sorrel or oxalis, trailing blackberry is everywhere, sword fern, miner's lettuce, piggyback plant. These are all species really common in a forested buffer. They are adapted to high shade, wet soils. They're just very, very typical. After 1 year after fire, the most common species in the forb layer across all our sites is fireweed. And we're still seeing trailing blackberry and miner's lettuce, but now we're also still seeing like ragwort and starflower. And these species I've highlighted were not common at all pre-fire, and now they're some of the most common species across our sites. 2 years later, we're seeing firewood again and trailing blackberry, but now also small willow herb, fringed willow herb, hairy cat's ear, or some dandelion species. We're seeing even more of these species that are not typical in a riparian, like stream-side buffer area. These are typical of high sunlight, highly disturbed areas. We see these typically after a forest harvest, for instance, but now we're seeing them all the way down to a stream. So our very early conclusions, obviously we're still working on this, but we're seeing a real complexity in the vegetation response. Overstory and shrub layers are negatively impacted by fire. Some species richness in the forb layer increases in response, but maybe temporarily. We're seeing the composition of the vegetation community change with fire for sure. And you can see in this photo from this site, this is right at a stream edge, and we're seeing foxglove and fireweed, looks like just starting to flower, just getting ready to flower. And that's usually not what you see next to a stream when it's a forested, shady buffer. And we're definitely seeing that the time since fire impacts vegetation layers differently. So we're seeing some flux in the forb layer, but less in the shrub, and that delay in the overstory, and perhaps they're interacting with each other. But I think that highlights the need for further study for this. Our plan is to look at longer-term changes with time since fire. I remember there was a talk yesterday saying they were seeing the forb layer change a lot 3 to 5 years since fire, so we're only at 2 so far. So we do plan to keep going on this work. And then we really want to tie into the impacts of post-fire management. So these landowners are sharing their information with us on their salvage and replanting, and we can tie that into the recovery of the riparian area and how those decisions impact recovery. So with that, I really would like to acknowledge all the landowners. This has been a unique opportunity with NCASI and forest industry partners to work together and share study sites and information. And we've been working together with a lot of partners. And we have got some great statisticians in-house. I really, really want to highlight how awesome our field crews have been. And I would like to plug that if you are a student or recent grad or know of recent grads, we're going to be flying our job posting for this year's field crew in the next week or two. So please reach out if you have any interest. It's a great project. With that, thank you. I think a couple of minutes. Yeah, a little bit of time for questions.
You said you pulled the older and younger forb data together. Was that because there was no difference and you just wanted to get the statistical strength?
Yeah, so there wasn't much difference yet in 2 years, and so just for brevity and for being able to tease out some of the differences from stream edge, I just decided to present that. But yeah, we'll be doing more of that down the road. Yep.
I'm not much of a botanist, but I had the impression, perhaps incorrect, that some species like foxglove or dandelion, the foxglove at least is an invasive or a introduced species, and I'm wondering how you think the seeds are getting there, whether it's hikers or land management activity or just coming downstream.
Yeah, so should I repeat the questions? Yeah, so some of these species, yes, are invasive. Those photos are from more of the managed side of things, so harvested areas, clear cuts are not far away, and those are very, very common on the landscape, so I think they're just filtering down from the nearest cut area. I don't think we're seeing them in the same amounts if we're teasing out between old forests and younger forests. Yeah.
Really nice job on the sort of spatial distribution of all that veg data, but just wondering, for that longer term, do you have any plans for some of the soils data, the soil nutrients, soil water
Yeah, so because we had to jump on this so quick, we don't have soils directly tied to this work, which is unfortunate, and that's always what comes up. So it could be something that we could add to later, but we did not do it right at the beginning, no.
I have a question as well. I was wondering, do you think that if we were to look back at maybe some legacy data for storm fires, that you can see that some of these really high-risk essential species are actually present that during some of these fire regimes?
Yeah, oh, sorry. So we're wondering if there's, some of those species were there already in the system from, if we look at historical data. Yeah, it's certainly possible, and the seed banks are there, and this, you know, in the mosaic too. I think that's incredibly possible. We just haven't done that work yet. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.